Sangama and founder of the Persian Hospitality Network. This was set up to help profile Persian people, food and brands operating in the UK food and hospitality sector. For a very long time, I've wanted to create a platform to celebrate and document all things Persian and culinary. So I'm delighted to be able to do this now. The first discussion is about rice, arguably the most important part of any Persian meal. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Sussan Babaie, who lectures on Iranian and Islamic arts at the Courtauld University of London. She's curated many exhibitions, including at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, amongst other things, and also lectures and publishes articles widely. Professor Babaie has a keen interest in Persian culinary history and is a big fan of rice, which is what we're going to talk about today. So, Professor Babaie, welcome. How are you?
Very well. Thank you very much for this very kind and generous introduction.
Should we just kick off firstly with your relationship with food, maybe personally and professionally? Can you just tell us a bit of background on that, please?
Relationship with food for someone like me, I feel like it's a very healthy one, in that I love to make food, I love to eat food, and I also am deeply interested in understanding its history of cuisines, learning about the ways in which raw material turn into these extraordinarily complex works of art, which is pretty much any dish that you can imagine, certainly in Persian cookery, but also in many other ones that we all know. It's this general interest also in the aesthetics of food, which is very attractive to me, in the sense that the sort of the artistic side, the way colors and textures and shapes come together with the carriers, the vessels, the dishes. And there are certain cuisines that depend heavily on this kind of a relationship. I think we all recognize this in Japanese food today. What interests me in particular as a historian is what defines, or what I think defines, an aestheticized idea about food in Persian cuisine. And it goes back as far as I can excavate from sources to the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, which is really what the interest for me is. I'm interested in looking at urbanity. I've worked a great deal on Esfahan, history of architecture and urban development of Esfahan. I also, in that context, I've looked at palaces of Esfahan and looked at the way in which spaces in these palaces are designed specifically for gathering of large number of people to feast together in the company of the Shahs. And this is a particular aspect of the early modern period in Iran, 16th, 17th centuries. We don't have these kinds of palatial structures or spaces, especially set up for conviviality, feasting, as a form of diplomacy, as a form of statecraft, essentially.
But your relationship with rice, if we just talk about that for a moment, I mean, how did you meet? Where did it start? You know, what's your favorite? How did your love of rice come about? Because I think obviously it's we all have our own kind of stories of this. So what does rice mean to you from a very
yeah, it's really difficult to pinpoint when did I meet rice. I mean, as an Iranian growing up in Iran, you encounter rice from the moment that you are able to sit at the table, primarily. So I think the love of rice is related to the sort of the ceremony that surrounds it. So rice for Iranians in general, and historically as well, is not a staple food. It's not like the bread that was always around and still is the staple food of Iranians. My father could not eat anything without some bread around, and that to me is the role of bread. I learned from him that you gotta have a bite of bread. But he could live without rice, and most often all of us lived without rice at certain meals. So when the rice shows up, that is festive, that is major, that is when you know that something is happening. And I think instinctively, even as children, we get that picture. And I think that's my encounter with rice is this kind of a, stars in your eyes. You see a mountain of rice on the table. Rice was really the food of the elite in the periods in history that I'm interested in looking at. And it becomes eventually more widely accessible, but it has never been the staple food of Iran. I mean, it's very commonly understood that at night you eat, Iranians used to eat, and this we know from, for instance, some of the travelers who went through Safavid Iran in the 16th and especially 17th centuries, the Iranians ate 2 meals. That's really crucial that they ate really 2 meals. And most of us know, at least from our backgrounds, that the evening meal was a haziri, a simple, quick thing you put together. And rice was not part of it. And I think we all know that eating a massive amount of rice at night is not particularly healthy. So the thing about it is that the Persian food is known historically as having been very healthy and very fresh. These two are the qualities that all the descriptions of Persian food in the 16th and 17th centuries underscore. And I think the changes, the habits having changed so that we all go out and work and it's only at night that we gather, or we have dinner parties, which when I was growing up, the main parties were lunch parties, not dinner parties. So you really understand the way rice functions in such an environment. It's a major food. It's made through the morning for long hours until the time of its unveiling and presentation.
Just for anyone watching this who may not be familiar with Persian cuisine,
Yeah.
What are the variations?
Like everywhere else, you have the long grain, like basmati rice, and the short grain rice. And the short grain rice that, for instance, is grown in Gilan is, I think most Iranians know, it's very fragrant. It's very special. Hardly anyone gets a hold of it anymore. It's decades since anyone has had proper Gilan rice. But that's a really perfect rice, perhaps, for the method that is much faster, and it boils it down, and it fluffs it up and gets all that flavor and aroma out of it. But the principal Persian rice cooking, so the boiled rice, is a method that we know from all other cuisines as well. You can find it in Turkish cuisine and in Central Asia and elsewhere. Depending on the rice, it could be sticky, as in further east and southeast Asia, or a bit less starchy. Uh, but the one that is truly an extraordinarily unique kind of a rice cooking, which we associate with Persian cuisine, is the one that takes several steps and long hours. You basically soak these long grain rice like basmati in salt and water, and then you boil it in clean fresh water with salt in there, and then you drain it when it is what we in from borrowed from another language, it's al dente essentially. and then you begin to assemble it for the purposes of steaming process. And that's when the rice becomes something really special. So this process, the third stage of making it in this exercise of steaming, is when you introduce oil and fruits and vegetables or nuts and meats and all kinds of other stuff. And each of these then are special. You don't just throw them all in there, but rather each has its own qualities. And it's there that Persian rice becomes a skill.
Beautifully put. I mean, it's a very good description. Thank you.
That's where the love of rice comes, right?
Yeah, you know, I sense the love. So that's wonderful. Thank you. So just going back now in terms of obviously you mentioned it wasn't always a staple for in terms of kind of Persian culinary behavior or habits. How did it come into how was it introduced into our culture? Where did it come from?
Some historians think that it has already arrived in earlier periods, maybe in the Parthian times, Sasanian times. But there is no word for rice in the Zoroastrian holy book, the Avesta. The word that we use, birinj, is a Sanskrit or a variation on Sanskrit for rice. And that sort of hints at the fact that rice probably came to Iran through South Asia. And so when exactly is still not fully documented. But what we do know is that after the Mongol invasions, rice becomes more widely available and also cultivated. And the places where the cultivation takes place is still where rice is cultivated, in Gilan, for instance, along the Caspian seashore area. The rice that we know at the time is not the kind of rice that we come to understand in modern day Iran, for which our history is really, I mean, if there is earlier than this period that I'm talking about, 16th, 17th centuries, it's not documented enough. So when you read about, let's say, the feasts around the major events during the time of Tamerlane, in these tented cities outside of Samarkand, for instance, you don't hear about rice so much as you hear about huge pieces of meat, almost like a portion of a horse, or, you know, major food of meat and other things. It's not, you know, I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying rice is not really the thing.
It's kind of almost common knowledge that a lot of not just our culinary history, but history full stop hasn't been documented particularly well. So whilst the first references that we know of are, as you say, in the 16th, 17th centuries, it could possibly have been that it existed prior to that, but it just hasn't been documented well enough. Is that fair to say?
So the absence of a group of or a cluster of evidence seems to indicate that whatever was there, and you're right, there's always a background to this. These didn't just show up out of nowhere, but that they are consolidated at this point into a proper set of recipes, if you will, is an indication of practices that then you bring together in what is a theory, perhaps, or a manual. So it's the same, you know, it's the same as, let's say, the first time we read a manual about how to make a chaharbagh is early 16th century, but there are chaharbaghs before that.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, you know, gosh, you're the expert on this, but I think it's one of those things where you look at if these references kind of point to these different types of rice and, you know, the techniques for different types of rice, that almost suggests a maturity of cooking, you know, so it suggests a kind of advancement. It's not just something that someone's cooked on a whim. So, so yeah, it's really interesting. Where were these references? Where can people see these if they were to try and look at them? Is this your private collection, or?
No, it's published. I mean, I can show you. There are the two manuals are published. This is my copy. You can see I have been working with it quite a lot. So it's a book called آشپزی دوره صفوی, and this was edited and made available by the late and great Professor Sussan Babaie, who did a lot of these texts. There's also one of these is translated by Qanun Parvar, which is called in a book Dining at the Safavid Court. And then besides those, there are, scattered studies that gather bits and pieces of information on these. So it's an understudied process.
If we could talk perhaps a little bit about how, and I'll get this right, how Persian rice or cuisine has kind of inspired others. Can you just maybe give us a quick overview of
yeah, sure. Yeah, I think there is, I mean, on this issue, we always need to tread lightly and carefully, I think. In part because we know that rice was also used in Central Asia, that there is a rice cuisine in Central Asia, which is very different from the one of the Persian rice, and the Persian rice is closer or is more akin to what many may understand to be Afghan rice making. There are some really interesting differences that you would use in Central Asia. Rice developed or cultivated in Central Asia comes very late, and it comes earlier in 20th century with the expulsion of Koreans, evidently, into Central Asia as refugees who grow rice there. And so it's a different form, and also a different species of rice, and also different cookery of rice. The names are the same, so they call it pilau or polo or pilau, but it is boiled, everything boiled together. And what they use is cottonseed oil, which gives a very different flavor to those. In Iran and in Afghanistan, most of the oil used is either vegetable or various animal-based fats. And the method of the Iranian cookery clearly of rice clearly is one that most likely had inspired what is called Mughal cuisine, and sort of North Indian type of cuisine, which is sensible to think that way in the way we also understand how the Mughal courts in the 16th and 17th centuries drew a great deal of sort of common cultural understanding out of what is Persianate culture. So if we don't think about these as countries, as separate countries, but think about them as cultural zones, which are connected to one another, then it makes a lot of sense that the Mughals were looking at the Timurids as their ancestors. Actually, they were looking at the Safavids, and the Safavids were looking at the Mughals. There are poets going back and forth, and artists are going back and forth, and statesmen going back and forth. It's not surprising to think of food also going with it.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned we touched on it earlier as well, the kind of etiquette of and behaviors around, particularly in some of these courts and palaces, as is documented. Can you maybe just give us an overview of how you saw some of that. If you can offer a bit of color in terms of how that, what that looked like.
Yeah, that's a really a very, to my mind, one of the most interesting parts of my research. I'm an architectural historian, to be very frank,
Yeah.
but the part that I found most interesting in writing my book on Esfahan and its palaces was where I started making sense out of the spaces in the palaces in Esfahan, like the Chehel Sutun or Ayn Khane or Talar Tavile, where this massive pillared hall in front, it has a certain shape that means, there are protocols of closeness and distance involved. So how you are seated. This sort of arrangement applies to food as well, or to the sort of sequence of events. The food part is described. We don't have it recorded in Persian sources, really annoyingly, but Europeans record these and talk about how cloths are brought out when the time comes to eat, which is signaled by the Shah. He is the host. This is really crucial. The Ottoman Sultan is never the host. Neither is really the Mughal emperor. And I don't think the French and the Habsburgs and any of them were really the host at this time, in the sense that the Shah is. And it's not just my opinion, it's actually recorded as such. So when he says begin, commence the food delivery, you have courses after courses. And it starts with what the Europeans complain that this is dessert to us. The Persian eat it first. So you have dishes, small dishes, brought out for everyone. All of these are removed, and then the second course is brought in. And in these courses, you actually do have things like sweets and fruit-like or salad-like stuff, and then khoresh-like, these stews with meats and vegetables and nuts and so forth. And it goes on for quite a while. The last of these is the rice. So the rice is brought out in those heaps, the mountain-like arrangement that we see in the cooking of the rice, actually. This is a really interesting part of it. When you cook it, you steam it by putting the rice in the pot for its final stage in the form of a mountain, right? And you deliver it like that. And one of these cookbooks says that the person who cooks the food, the rice, should be the one who delivers the rice, because only he knows what is the right way of doing this and what goes with what. So it's usually the final meal that the rice comes out. It's really the sort of the finale event. And that's when we hear about the beauty of these. And the cookbooks talk about how to put it together so that it's colorful, so that every piece of it, let's say it has meats or chicken or nuts and fruits and so forth, that they are composed like a painting. The word like a painting is used, naqashane, and that the cook even suggests that you should use these chini. Chini is in Persian in reference to blue and white porcelain, or the Iranian version of it, which is glazed ceramic, actually, of which we have a whole bunch of them. So the point is that there is not only there is a sequence of delivery of food, but there are dishes that are specifically used. And in the case of the rice, it's those big round platters, which are distinctive to the ceramic production of this period in Safavid Iran.
Finally, if you don't mind, can you just paint us a picture of what a kind of a typical Persian party in those days would have looked like? So from a how would people be sat? What's the kind of format that they would follow?
Well, typical is only as far as we know from the court context. So we don't know about homes.
Sure.
The ordinary people, even the elite, we know that the elite did hold events, and there are, tidbits of information that tell us that these were very beautifully appointed mansions in Isfahan, that they had song and dance, and they had, really receptions for people. But we can talk about people even at that level, this sub-imperial level. So what I can dig out of the sources is about the court environment, where a reception oftentimes, and it's really interesting to think of them in particular sites. So let's say this is a Nowruz related reception, a Persian New Year related reception, or the reception given for a guest from elsewhere, as in the deposed ruler of the Uzbeks who took refuge in Isfahan came to visit Shah Abbas, in which case, such cases, the guests are held waiting at the main palace gateway, and indeed are already given khil'at, a proper sort of formal gift of a costume, and then through a very beautifully appointed alleyway where the horses are standing on either side with their grooms and bejeweled saddles and so forth. So you finally are brought into, let's say you're brought into the garden and then talar of the Talar Tabile, which was one of the famous sort of reception areas, or the Chehel Sutun. So there is this whole sort of, the expectation is rising as you slowly are brought to where you actually are seated, where you see the Shah and the company, where you're entertained. Usually entertainment comes next. And by the way, there's a lot of wine going around in these cases. And we know that in the variety of ceramic vessels for these communal gatherings, wine bottles are really numerous, and the variety and the different technologies and so forth, and wine cups. And there's a famous painting of Shah Abbas offering a cup of wine to his guest, in fact. And then comes, after entertainment and so forth, these courses after courses of the meals, ending with the rice. If the party is not to go further, it ends then. And the Shah leaves. If he wants it to end, he leaves, and everybody else leaves. There's sometimes complaints from the guests about, I wasn't finished, for instance. But if he wants to stay and he wants to continue, then the real drinking begins. And that goes into early hours of the morning. It's a pretty intensely choreographed, rich, sensuous, rich sensory experiences involved, textiles, smells, sounds. It's just an incredible scene when you think about it. And it starts in the afternoon and can go on, for a very long time. I'm
really grateful for that. Thank you for your
I'm delighted.
Time. It was marvelous. I think for those of you who are watching, thank you for joining us. We will be covering more of these subjects in the future. If there are any particular areas you'd like to kind of explore or discuss, please do just DM us. As I said before, the aim of the Persian Hospitality Network is to really profile people, food, and brands in the food and hospitality sector. So do let us know if there's anything you'd like us to feature. Thank you so much again, Professor Babaie. I'm really grateful for your time, and hopefully we can catch up again at some stage soon.